Hey troops, what's going on? Dit Commando here. My name's Ryan. I'm a former Royal Marine from the United Kingdom. I'm getting a few steps closer to actually becoming a fully fledged Royal Marine again in the reserves. I've got my application in to rejoin the military guys and to wear the coveted green beret yet again. So stay tuned for that, for updates, everything else, okay? But today we're going to be reacting to The World Without the United States Part 2. We did the first part of this, and it went literally through the roof. It did really, really well. And I forgot about part 2 actually, so here is part 2, guys. The original video is in the description as well if you want to go check them out and give them a subscribe. But thank you for being here. Make sure to like, share and subscribe to my channel yourself, and go check out my other channel, Dit Gaming. We're nearly at 1,000 subscribers as we speak. I'm going to be doing all of my different gameplay videos on there, so if you are a bit of a gamer like myself, then go check that channel out, guys. All right, but without any further ado, we're going to get straight into this one. Boom.
A world without the U.S., we looked at the ways that World War II and the post-war era might have turned out if the U.S. had simply refused to engage the world and remained isolationist. We discovered that there would be a near certainty of a World War II that ended with a stalemate heavily favoring Germany and positioning it for unrivaled superpowerdom in Europe. We also saw how U.S. non-interference in Korea would have led to a unified and communist Korea with strong ties to the USSR and China, prompting a resurrection of the Japanese imperial state. Today, we're going to see what might have happened if the U.S. exited the world stage at various points in history after the
post-World War II, America seemed to do really, really well financially. Their economy went through the roof, and they've been literally a superpower ever since, and a huge superpower of that.
Post-World War II era, Iranian democracy. Without the U.S.'s interference in Iran, the revolution that brought down the monarchy and ushered in a fundamentalist government may not have played out the way it did in our world. In fact, a revolution which would end up with a religious fundamentalist government may have never been necessary in the first place, were it not for U.S. and British interference in 1953 that saw a democratically elected prime minister ousted by a military coup d'etat organized by MI6 and the CIA. Britain, who owned a majority share of the Anglo-Persian oil company, today BP Oil, saw their continued ownership of the Iranian company as vital to their national interests, as it helped alleviate their budget shortfalls and also powered their oil-fired navy. However, Iranians began to chafe that the British continued to be the primary beneficiary of the company's revenues, and in 1953, newly elected Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry. This did not sit well with the British at all, and they immediately besieged the U.S. for help in overthrowing Mossadegh. Initially, the U.S. was opposed to the idea and saw the British as meddlesome and destructive to the nation of Iran. But when Britain claimed that Mossadegh may in fact draw close to the Soviet Union, an unlikely event, the British played to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's worst fear, communist expansion around the world. Thus, he
Right, so a little bit of British, American, trying to get each other working together and stuff. It's always been that way, really, and especially after, World War I and II, Britain and America have pretty much been brothers ever since.
Proved the overthrow of Mossadegh, and the CIA and MI6 immediately went to work, manipulating the Iranian public into supporting the Shah's removal of Mossadegh from his democratically elected position. Without the US, Britain would have been unable to remove Mossadegh from power, which would have resulted in a crippling blow to the British economy as it lost its controlling share of one of the largest oil companies in the world. Iran's own economy would have flourished, as would have its democratic values, as popular leaders such as Mossadegh cultured a strong, secular, and socially aware Iran that year by year ate the political power of the Shah. In many respects, Iran could today resemble Britain, a strong democracy with a nobility that serves as nothing more than figureheads who wield no real political power whatsoever. Seeing its own values reflected in a strong Iranian democracy, the U.S. would have seen Iran as a real.
Sorry guys, I've just sometimes I'll like zone out and stuff, and then other things I'll find funny, but that face there, man. He's holding his phone, he's smiling. Yeah, I don't know. Am I a bit of a loser for finding that funny? Let me know in the comments.
regional partner rather than the potential foe it's considered today, as a counterbalance to the growing influence of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. With the Persian Gulf being the main tap for the global oil supply, the European democracies would have vied to establish strong ties with Iran. And while the Soviet Union would have sought to strengthen its own ties with Iraq, both sides vying for political influence in the most oil-rich region in the world. The reason why is simple. While contrary to popular opinion, today's governments of the West don't plunder Middle Eastern oil for their own benefit. Rather, a strong influence in the region gives them the strategic capability to shut off the oil tap for potential enemies, such as China or Russia. In essence, one side could shut off the flow of oil to the other side in the case of a war. And that's what makes the Middle East so strategically important to the world. With
extremely strategically important. One could argue, without getting too political about the whole thing, that that is pretty much the default reason why war always breaks out in that area. Who controls the oil fields controls pretty much the world's wealth, okay? It's just the way it is, all right? And again, let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with that. It always seems to be, though, yeah, about oil. Oil funds wars, wars create boosts in economy through selling of munitions, weaponry, technology, services. And what I mean by services is a destabilized area. Hey, we can fix that. We'll come in, we'll sort it out, and in return, we want, you know, a bargaining power of oil and wealth, all of that kind of good stuff. Okay, guys, it's sold as democracy and trying to create democracies in areas that haven't got one, but in another way, it's all to do with oil and money, really. But again, let me know in the comments what you think about that.
Western Europe and the Soviet Union vying for influence and power in the Middle East, it would have inevitably led to massive Middle East war. While it would likely not have been of a scale appropriate enough to term World War III, the US's exit from the Middle East would have without a doubt launched a regional conflict to rival any of the largest European wars. During the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, the Soviet Union heavily supported Iraq, and after the war, Iraq was sitting on piles of Soviet hardware and a huge national budget deficit. This would lead to the invasion of oil-rich Kuwait, and in our world, this invasion was stopped by a US-led coalition. In a world where the US decided to simply walk away from the world, though, Iraq would have very quickly turned its attention on regional rival and very oil-rich nation Saudi Arabia. At the time, Saudi Arabia relied heavily on US protection, and the US saw Saudi Arabia as not just a vital economic partner, but a vital strategic partner as well, whose location allowed the US to ensure it could control the global oil tap in case of war against Russia or China. The US thus supplied much of the Saudi military and even helped train it, and when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was Saudi Arabia who saw the first US troops land, and were immediately dispatched into defensive positions to protect Saudi Arabia's oil wealth, while the
Again, it's the oil that keeps on coming into it, isn't it, guys?
Saudi's own military largely remained a supporting and token force. Without the US, however, Saudi Arabia would never have been able to withstand an Iraqi attack, who Saudi wealth in order to pay off its massive deficit incurred by the almost decade-long war with Iran. Seizing Saudi oil supplies, Iraq would have become a regional superpower, firmly entrenched with the Soviet Union, and in effect giving the Soviets control over the majority of the world's oil supplies. Western Europe would have immediately financed a war against Iraqi aggression in a bid to avert this strategic catastrophe. But without US firepower and military coordination, the coalition that took out Saddam's forces in the first Gulf War would have been dramatically underpowered. Throughout the campaign, it was US intelligence and recon assets that coordinated coalition attacks, and US stealth aircraft who launched crippling blows against what was at the time one of the world's most formidable air defense networks. Equally important, though, was American pressure on Israel and the efforts of US troops to hunt down Iraqi Scud launchers targeting Israel that prevented that nation from retaliating.
Yeah, and a little bit of information for the Americans out there who might not have heard of Bravo 20, you know, the SES mission that occurred in and around that time, okay, when the Scud missiles were wreaking havoc on Israel. A lot of British special forces were involved in that strategically, okay, going in there, getting information, destroying those Scud missiles, which a lot of people don't know about, because Britain, you know, we don't, I'm not saying we don't get the recognition that we deserve, but we were certainly the smaller part of that. That big, so to speak. America was the big counterpart, and Britain was a very small part of that. So
against Iraq, and thus upsetting the rest of the Islamic states in the coalition, tearing the alliance apart. Soviet military assistance would have flowed directly into Iraq, possibly even extending into actual combat assistance, such as that provided to China during the Korean War against the US. In our world, the presence of overwhelming American firepower.
Sorry, a little bit more information on that. That event that I was talking about was in the 90s, I think, early 90s.
Power at the head of a huge international coalition kept the Russians out of the Gulf War. But in a world without the US, the international coalition against Iraq would have been decidedly weaker, and victory much more achievable for Iraq. The Soviet Union would have thus thrown its full support.
Yeah, I mean, you look at any kind of scenario in that regards without America, it would be, without America, everything in terms of the wars would be harder if they're on your side, because how can I put this? It's just the power that they've got. It's the influence that they've got. If you're fighting against anyone who's allies with the United States, then you're in for a tough day. All right, they're not going to back down, and they've got the weaponry, they've got the tactics, the training, the capability, the mentality to be able to push on. Where other militaries around the world just simply haven't, guys. So a scenario where America is not in that, wars are going to be fought, and it's going to be a lot easier for them to kind of reach a decision, so to speak.
Support behind Iraq, with little fear of facing retaliation from the comparatively much weaker Western European nations. After an Iraqi victory and the seizing of Saudi Arabia's vast oil wealth, a healthy stream of very lucrative oil contracts would have flowed into the Soviet Union, enriching it economically and perhaps averting its eventual collapse. Cuba-centric South America. Almost from the moment Fidel Castro took power and ousted the US-backed dictator ruling Cuba, the United States tried to remove him from office. Yet in a world without the US, Cuba would have been free to export its revolution abroad, targeting neighboring countries with its communist revolutionary fervor. Here in the real world, though, the US failed to remove Castro from power, yet it was very successful at limiting or outright countering the influence of Cuba's revolutionaries in other nations. For decades, the US and Cuba, backed by the Soviet Union, fought an undeclared war of influence, and sometimes actual weapons, in countries throughout South and Central America. The US, fearful of communist expansion in its
Right, who's this guy supposed to be then? Who is this guy supposed to be? He looks pretty hench, that's for sure. With pink hair?
backyard, did all it could to eliminate that threat, even going so far as to depose democratic governments, such as it did in Chile when its governments became too friendly with communist Cuba or the Soviet Union. Without the US, however, communist influence would have spread across the southern part of the Western Hemisphere, and today Central and South America would likely be made up of communist states and a small number of very communist.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've never been to South America, so I can't comment on how it is over there, but a lot of my friends have been with the military and on holiday as well. How would the place be? I know communism brings certain elements to it, obvious elements by default, but how would these areas in particular react to communist rule? Because communism's slightly different in each country that is under communist rule. It depends on the area. How would South America be? Let me know in the comments.
Friendly democracies. Many dictators and the brutal atrocities they committed while in power against their political enemies would not have arisen or maintained power. Without U.S. support, Chile's own General Augusto Pinochet would never have succeeded in overthrown elected Salvador Allende and gone on to become one of South America's most oppressive dictators. The Soviet Union survives and wins the Cold War. If the United States had decided to pull all its troops home after World War II and taken no interest in global politics, there's no doubt that the Soviet Union would have won the Cold War against the democratic West. Without American firepower in Europe, the Western democracies would have been forced to stand alone against the Soviet juggernaut, which vastly overshadowed European forces in both scope and capability.
Yeah, and that is an image that I don't really want to think of, guys, if Europe and Great Britain were under communist rule. It's, our freedoms that we kind of explore and we experience to this very day is directly linked to the fact that United States was part of the war in that respect. So thinking about that, I'm actually very grateful. I'm patriotic to Great Britain, but I'm realistic as well to understand that you can be a tough SOB such as Great Britain, and our military, we're the British Bulldogs, aren't we? We're tough, but we're nothing in terms of scale without the support from the United States, and for that I'm grateful. Our freedoms that we experience today is all because of that. So that's why, when I say I've got great love for America, it's not just because I've served with the Royal Marines. It's not just because I've worked alongside the U.S. military. It's not just because I've went to their beautiful country and had a wonderful time there. It's because I truly appreciate that, So yeah.
Titanic political clout of an unchallenged Soviet Union would have easily bent even France and Britain to its will, lest they face the wrath of the largest mechanized force in world history all on their own. For decades, the United States carefully outmaneuvered the Soviet Union on the international front, resulting in a stunning defeat of the Soviet Union after it was completely economically isolated from the rest of the world. The Soviet Union always fielded a greater number of forces, and the United States always relied on superior numbers of nuclear weapons to keep a parity of power between the two states. However, the end result of decades of sly U.S. international maneuvering was a world where the Soviet Union's greatest economic allies were the small third and second world governments it had backed in Vietnam, Korea, and other places, leaving the Soviet behemoth slowly starving as the world preferred trade with the U.S. and its allies over the Soviets. Without America, the Soviet Union would have been the greatest economic power in the world, and profit alone would have encouraged the nations of the world to trade with it. This great economic clout would have made an untouchable superpower, and given it enough influence to economically isolate Western democracies in much the same way that the U.S. did to the Soviet Union in our world. Interestingly enough, though, rather than remaining a hardline communist power, the Soviet Union would likely have resembled a more modern-day China than the communist stalwart we know from the Cold War. Much like China, its growing exposure to global trade would have seen it relinquish central control of the economy in exchange for dramatic economic growth. As China today, the Soviet Union of a world without America would have been a political communist power with a free market system. Nukes everywhere! The greatest casualty of a world without the US, however, would have been the cause of international nuclear peace. Today, US allies from Japan to South Korea to even Britain and Germany all live under the protection of the American nuclear umbrella, with the assurance.
Right, that's very, something I've never actually thought of, that American nuclear umbrella. Now, some say we don't need nukes, but in a world where we have rising superpowers, some of them that we don't really want to have a big influence around the world because of some of their political views. That is a safety umbrella nonetheless. Although we wouldn't want it to be actioned, it does protect us, and it protects us very, very well.
That a nuclear attack against one of the US's protected states would result in an American nuclear response. While Britain and France still choose to remain nuclear independent, the American nuclear umbrella has ensured that the majority of nations it covers see no need in pursuing a nuclear weapons program, resting secure in the knowledge that no matter what, the US will abide by its promise to protect its allies. A purposeful strategy, the US has for decades shouldered the burden of protecting other nations, knowing that by doing so, it could limit the threat of nuclear proliferation. Less nuclear-capable states in the world means that the world at large remains safer from the threat of nuclear war. Yet, without the US, many nations around the world would desperately seek out weapons of their own. Britain and France, who already have a small nuclear arsenal, would dramatically increase the number of nuclear weapons they each hold, especially in light of how powerful the Soviet Union would have become without the US to counterbalance its military and political influence. The Soviets themselves proved to be less concerned with nuclear proliferation than the US, and would have likely done little to prevent regimes in places such as Syria and Libya from developing their own nuclear weapons. Even today in our real world, despite assurances of protection from the US, nations such as Jordan and Saudi Arabia both desperately want their own nuclear programs, and Turkey.
And so when I went to Jordan in the Royal Marines, we were there, and I learned quite a bit about the Middle East and how Jordan is actually quite a in a strong position. It's almost like the gateway to the Middle East for the Western countries, for America, Great Britain. It's the brother, the friendly Middle Eastern brother that kind of keeps everywhere in check all around there. Okay. It definitely keeps all of the bordering countries in check, and it does a very good job of it. That's why it's important, I think, to have a very good relationship with Jordan.
He has long sought for NATO nuclear weapons to be under its own control, something the US flat out denied. With the threat of a rising China and a nuclear North Korea, Japan remains confident that it can rely on its American allies. Yet without the US, Japan would have been forced to develop its own nuclear weapons program. In the real world, a Japanese government internal document even went so far as to hypothesize how quickly Japan could develop its own nuclear weapons if it decided it needed to. A world without the US would look vastly different than the one we know today. Perhaps better in some areas and vastly worse in others.
Vastly worse, guys. Vastly worse.
Any other nation, the US has its fair share of.
Yeah, I can't even bear to imagine a world without the United States. It's one of those things, isn't it? Really, now that you don't really appreciate what someone does for you when they're doing it all the time, and it's a little bit like that with America. I feel with the rest of the world, there's that appreciation or lack of appreciation just because they're there. They're there policing the world's problems all the time, and it's just not appreciated as much as it maybe should be. But yeah, I appreciate it, guys.
Villainous and heroic deeds alike, though the consequences of its actions are magnified on a greater scale than any other nation due to its power. Still, given the state of the world today, it can be hard to argue against the course the US has plotted throughout the 20th century, despite the many missteps along the way. Today, the US stands as the world's sole superpower after defeating the Soviet Union, and now at last is the time for Americans to demand that the US acts true to its declared values, as it'll likely never have this opportunity in history again. What do you think a world without the US?
Right, guys, let's have a bit of a chat with that. What if World Without United States Part 2, as good as the first part, guys? I really enjoyed that. I wish it was a Part 3, 4, and 5. But infographics, is as much as some of the content I don't agree with, it is actually good. It's very informative, and it's pretty good reactionary material, to be fair. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Press that like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And yeah, I really enjoyed that one, guys. I'm looking forward to doing something like this very, very soon in the future. Peace and love always.